Airplanes, more than any other development, have changed the face of war in the 20th century. Among aviation experts, pilots, and enthusiasts, there has long been a spirited debate as to which aircraft, be it a bomber, fighter, or attack craft, is the very best of all time. Join us as we look at superior planes in each aircraft category and finally settle all bets during Airpower Showdown. Bombers. Bombers, it might be said, have changed the face of warfare more than any single factor in the 20th century. Not long after the Wright brothers invented their successful airplane, they were demonstrating its capabilities to the Army. Soon, the airplane was dropping explosives farther behind enemy lines and more accurately than any artillery of the time. By the end of World War I, day and night bombing missions over hundreds of miles had become common. For the rest of the century, bombing techniques, the airplanes that delivered the bombs, and the bombs themselves have seen refinements no one could have imagined at the time the airplane first went to war. Dramatic increases in the loads the bombers could carry, their stability and the altitudes they could drop from, and the distances they could fly made modern bombers a terrifying threat to an enemy. And particularly when the first atomic weapons were unleashed, the world saw a new horror in the massive and immediate devastation that one airplane could bring about. Now, as the century ends, major air forces of the world fly aircraft that can deliver their explosive cargo at extremely high speeds or from miles above the battlefield, out of reach of anti-aircraft fire and a tough target for ground-based missiles. Bombers have two basic roles. Strategic bombing is intended to reduce the enemy's ability in a general sense to wage war, as well as to hinder their will to win. A strategic bombing attack may be against oil storage depots, lines of supply like rail yards, an airfield, or even an industrial city. But strategic bombing is not a precise science. It's a crude hammer against an enemy, and results are not always easily measured. Tactical bombing is intended to affect the outcome of a given battle. Usually, tactical bombing takes place close to a front line and is usually against specific battlefield assets, such as a tank or invading troops or artillery or missile emplacements. Which are the best bombers of all time? A worldwide panel of experts assembled by the editors of Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine have reviewed bombers from World War I to today. This panel of 25 historians, combat flying veterans, commanders, test pilots, and aircraft designers has picked the best one from nominees for each of 6 eras. A CompuServe forum was opened for votes as well. At the end of this program, you'll find out which of the 6 bombers is selected as the best bomber ever. But first, how do the experts judge the capabilities of bombers? Just what criteria do they use to evaluate them? A bomber's impact on the war is first and foremost the obvious measure. The bomber needs to weather enemy threats and get to the targets, carry enough of the right weapons, deliver them successfully, and then get home again. But after all that, what are the results?
We have had a revolution in aerial warfare. There's no doubt about it. The stealth technology worked probably better than even I thought it would. When you think that those airplanes night after night after night went to the most heavily defended target in the world, probably in Baghdad, with all the thousands of guns and hundreds of SAMs, and came back without taking a scratch, that has to be a revolution.
Their ability to penetrate hostile airspace is critical. For instance, the F-111, with supersonic low-level flying ability, can get to a target before it's seen by radar or targeted by ground fire.
particularly on night one, we were flying at low altitude, high speed, doing a toss maneuver on an airfield. I felt really confident that we could avoid all the threats we needed to, particularly the air-to-air threats. I was not worried about for the most part. I didn't think any Iraqi pilots would be coming down and taking a look at us at low altitude as we were flying.
Range allows the bomber to travel far and reach deep to hit an enemy and still get back to base. Intercontinental bombers like the B-52 have set a new standard for long-distance missions. Aerial refueling, when it's available, can extend the range of bombers even further.
And we can strike anywhere, anytime, over a very long distance. Its ability to go very far forward and make a tremendous impact immediately is its greatest asset.
The bomb load available is an important criteria. Light strike bombers carry less than the long-range strategic bombers, but given the aircraft design and mission, when it comes to bombs, more is better.
B-17 was not exactly a heavy bomb load carrier compared to today's airplanes. You needed quite a few airplanes to deliver the tonnage that they wanted in any particular target, so that's why they're making up so many airplanes to hit a particular target. It would be one group after another to sort of saturate bomb the particular target you were assigned that day.
The accuracy of targeting, a result of the bomb delivery system, and the airplane's stability and control predictability makes a huge difference. Now some systems allow the pilots or weapons officers to adjust the bomb's course while it's falling with laser or TV guidance precision.
Because they are guided en route, you can be a little bit off when you release them and still hit the target, as opposed to an unguided bomb where you have to have your conditions exact when you release it or it'll miss. So it's a lot more forgiving, and that was one of the things that led to our over 92% hit rate.
Defensive capabilities. For early bombers and on through World War II, defense came in the form of machine guns. Now it's more likely flares to ward off missiles or stealth technology to make the airplane blind to radar, or speed, as it was with the quick HE-111.
Being faster than any fighter of the time, this meant that an opposing fighter couldn't catch up with it. So this made the pilots show they were overjoyed with it.
Survivability. Can the bomber withstand or evade attack by ground fire, or from fighters, or from surface-to-air missiles? And if hit, does it still have a chance of taking its pilots and crew home? One pilot talks about B-17s.
This airplane would sustain damage that would put other aircraft on the ground immediately. There's no doubt about it. Everyone understands that this was probably the safest bomber to be in an attack position from that there has ever been built, at least to my knowledge.
The first era of bombers, 1910 to 1925, saw the earliest efforts at using airplanes in war, with some bombing skirmishes even before World War I and at the outset of the war. Bombers were quickly developed by most major nations. Larger airplanes with more engines quickly evolved with one goal in mind: carry more bombs farther into enemy territory. The nominees for Best Bomber of this first era of flight are the de Havilland DH-4, built under license in the U.S. It was the only American-built bomber to fly in the First World War. The Gotha G4 and 5. With a 77-foot wingspan, it was among the larger bombers of the First World War. The Handley Page 0400. Britain's answer to the Gotha, it had a 100-foot span and could carry a 1,650-pound bomb. And the Zeppelin. These lighter-than-air dirigibles could hover over a target for long periods of time. And the winner, the Gotha bombers. They routinely carried 6 110-pound bombs on raids to Britain with a pilot and navigator aboard. There was, for daytime missions, a gunner as well. The Gotha 4 started its raids on Britain in May of 1917. and the immediate result was that British aviation had to be pulled back from the French front to defend the homeland. The G5, with a ceiling of 21,000 feet and range over 500 miles, shifted to nighttime raids in September of 1917 to counter the strong British daylight defense. Peter Gross is a leading World War I historian who specializes in German aviation.
So the real secret, what made the Gotha such an effective bomber, is that when the Germans began to implement strategic bombing in 1917, the Gotha was the only airplane, twin-engine airplane, that could carry, let's say, a respectable bomb load and at the same time have the range to drop bombs on London. This plane could carry out 7 or 8 hour missions flying in or out over London and back. So that's what made the Gotha, that's why the Gotha was used.
Peter Kilduff is also an historian and expert on World War I.
The most successful Gotha raids came at night. They flew over usually on a dark night, dark moonless night. There would be 6 to a squadron, and you would have several squadrons collaborating on large raids, smaller groups on lesser raids. In one case, there were almost 20 aircraft on a raid, going again right into London.
On the 7th of July, 1917, 22 Gotha bombers reached London and devastated the area around St. Paul's Cathedral, including London's main post office. 57 civilians died and 193 were injured in that one raid.
So what the Gotha did strategically, it tied down a great amount of the British defensive forces in London and forced the withdrawal of some top-notch fighter squadrons to the British Isles, plus guns and manpower to defend London. And the Gotha has become, just by virtue of its prowess and what it did over England, let's say that and a Zeppelin, becomes sort of a generic term for the destructiveness of the World War I bomber. You talk about the Gothas, just like Snoopy talks about the Red Baron.
Peter Kilduff interviewed John Canauer, a Gotha pilot.
He said, with these tremendous big wings, he said, it was like you're out there soaring, and very, very responsive. He told me he thought it might be like trying to drive an elephant down a small street, but in fact, it was riding on an elephant on a pretty big street. The airplane was very responsive for a bomber. Said that in his estimation, the best of the night bombers was the Gotha.
During the period between 1926 and 1942, bombers sprang from small attack models or from airplanes originally conceived as passenger-carrying aircraft. Or bombers were developed by nations with secret plans. At Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, Japan's surprise attack on the U.S. fleet in 1941 showed just how successfully refined its bombers had become. The nominees for Best Bomber during this era are the Junkers Ju-88, a high-speed bomber that took on the roles of attack, reconnaissance, and fighter as well. The Douglas SBD Dauntless. SBD became slow but deadly. This 1930s model bombed in the Pacific throughout World War II. Aichi D-3A Val. Designed in Japan in 1936, it was a key attacker during the raid on Pearl Harbor. The Nakajima B-5N Kate, also involved in the bombing of Pearl Harbor, this carrier-based model carried bombs or torpedoes. The Heinkel HE-111. Developed by Germany as an airliner, it was secretly turned into a bomber and used in the Spanish Civil War. The Vickers Wellington. When World War II began, it was Britain's finest bomber, with the range to reach Germany. And the winner, the Heinkel HE-111. To some, the Heinkel 111 looks like a bullet with wings. It was one of the sleekest and fastest airplanes of its era. Developed first as a passenger-carrying airliner, it was then turned into a bomber. The sleek design made visibility for the pilot difficult at best. All the flying was done by a single pilot. Herb Weber flies one for the Confederate Air Force, an organization that preserves and flies wartime aircraft.
It's the only Heinkel in the world that's still flying. It's a former German bomber, and we take it out on tours, display it to the public for history purposes. The airplane operated with one pilot, and up front they had a bombardier and gunner in the nose, and they had 3 gunners in the back. It was a single pilot operation. It was a blitz bomber. I believe they built 8,000 of them, and they come in at low level. They didn't have a bomb site per se, just sort of a makeshift bomb site. And what they did was just low level and drop their bombs on whatever they thought they could destroy. And the airplane carries 8 500-pound bombs, so that's a pretty good lot of explosives.
Bill Nagel helped restore this 111 for the Confederate Air Force.
A blitz bomber, if you take the word blitz, blitz in German means lightning. So it means lightning attack bomber, and that's exactly what it was. It went in fast, surprise attacks, did its destruction, went on to the next target. And the idea was to use this aircraft, a fleet of these aircraft, to attack the Low Countries, Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, France, as quick as possible. That was Hitler's aim. And until the Battle of Britain, when they came up against a superior fighter force, the airplane pretty much had its own way.
Herbert Knobel was one of the Luftwaffe bomber pilots. He flew 162 missions.
I had an assignment to go over to England, and I forgot the town now, and I was in the combat area. I had to stay as high as I could with the plane, and I had to light the target with parachute lights on it, and I had to stay over the area for quite a while. And naturally, after you are there, the searchlight gets you, and when the searchlight have you in a focal point, then the anti-aircraft have you. And then when it got a little bit too hairy, I just put the Heinkel 111 in a spin at nights from about 20,000 feet, and I got it out about 3,000 feet. And then we just made it home, and we came home and had a couple of anti-aircraft holes in the wing, but we made it safely home. That was one of the, and if you do something like this, you suddenly realize how familiar you are with the plane and how you, there was nothing that, you felt absolutely safe in the plane, let's put it this way.
Despite being shot down on a later mission and crash landing in the English Channel, Knobel's faith in his 111 is unbroken.
Whenever you ask me about the Heinkel 111, I would say there's no better plane everywhere. You know, but to tell you different particulars, I don't know. It's just the security you feel.
It wasn't a precision bomber. They used it to get in, dump a bunch of explosives, and get out, and do it in a hurry because the airplane was so fast. When the airplane was built, it was way ahead of its time as far as speed and design and everything. So that's why they had the advantage in the beginning.
The next era of wartime bombers, 1943 to 1946, incorporates those that became key to the outcome of the war. These bombers gained refinements to allow them to better defend themselves, to deliver greater loads more precisely, and to reach deep into enemy territory from bases safely on the other side of the lines. The nominees for Best Bomber of this era: the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. It evolved from a coastal defense aircraft to become the symbol of American resolve to win against all odds. The North American B-25 Mitchell, the ideal medium bomber and the mainstay of Doolittle's Tokyo Raiders. Consolidated B-24 Liberator. More of these were built, 18,000, than any other American aircraft, and it served in every wartime theater. Avro Lancaster, 4 Rolls-Royce engines and a huge bomb bay made this British entry the only aircraft that could carry the 22,000-pound Grand Slam bomb. De Havilland Mosquito. It could cruise over enemy territory at 40,000 feet and 400 miles an hour. Boeing B-29 Super Fortress. This was the airplane tasked to burn Japan to the ground, and the first to strike with atomic bombs. And the winning bomber, the Boeing B-17. By the time the final version was introduced, the B-17G model in 1943, it could carry a devastating load of bombs and protected itself with 13 50-caliber machine guns. The B-17 was a bomber, but so effective defensively that its gunners claimed to have shot down more enemy fighters than did any other American aircraft of the war. Harold Weakley, a B-17 pilot, completed 19 missions and was downed on his 20th.
Of course, nobody liked to attack a B-17. A B-17 was a pretty good piece of iron, and they really didn't look forward to it, but they had to because they were trying to defend their country, as of course we were defending our philosophies.
Ultimately, the raids pushed to the heart of Germany itself and across Germany to its major eastern cities, Berlin, Leipzig, and Dresden. Germany unleashed an increasingly massive concentration of fighters to defend the homeland.
My first mission was to Berlin. I would much have preferred to have a little shorter mission and maybe something in France, but it was a long mission, very difficult. Of course, you know that they would defend their capital as we would defend our capital, and we lost a lot of aircraft there, a lot of anti-aircraft, a lot of fighters, and it was really quite an indoctrination.
Paul Kelly flew 26 missions into the heart of Germany from 1943 to 1945.
U.S. Air Force mission for daylight bombing, yes, it fit the role very well because it could do exactly what they were planning to do with it, which is high altitude, so-called precision bombing, and supposedly being able to defend itself in daylight raids. The British thought we were crazy, but the U.S. persisted, and despite all the losses, in the end they did what they set out to do.
Perhaps most amazing was how many B-17s survived, despite what they faced on each raid, to fly new missions again and again.
On occasion, I have been I would think, in the middle of a formation, and I could see airplanes ahead of me all the way into the target. And then on the way back out, I could see formations still going in. So we're talking of great numbers because each of those dots that you were looking at was a group of 54 airplanes. So it was quite a bomber stream, and I'm thankful that I was in the position I was instead of being on the ground.
Bill Service completed 20 missions and was shot down on his 21st.
Well, it's a very docile airplane, doesn't have bad habits, flying habits, very easy to fly. Has a nice big vertical fin and rudder, which makes it much easier to handle with an engine out. It was an extremely good airplane in terms of structural integrity with combat damage, because many 17s came back that looked like they should have never made it. So all in all, it was a great airplane.
It was a comfortable feeling, if you want to call it that, to be in that airplane. It sustained a lot of battle damage, so you felt fairly secure and that the airplane was going to come back with its U in it. There's the classic picture of a B-17 that came back that had been rammed by a 109, almost cut the airplane in half back at the waist, and the 109 fell away and supposedly crashed, but that airplane flew back almost cut in half.
Well, I believe the fact that it was a good aircraft to fly, it had good altitude capability, very stable bombing platform, had good range, and take and absorb a lot of battle damage and still get home.
That it brought me home 19 times. It supported me on the 20th time long enough for me to get our entire crew out of the airplane, and that's all I ever asked for.
The fourth era of fighting planes is 1947 to 1960, when the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union put new requirements on bombers and spawned the civil defense generation, fearing the possibility of a surprise nuclear attack from another continent. The bombers nominated are the Boeing B-47 Stratojet. This swept-wing bomber could outpace the fastest fighters, but never dropped a bomb in combat. The Convair B-36 Peacemaker. Ordered early in World War II, it first flew in 1946 with maximum range over 8,000 miles and a crew of 15. The Tupolev Tu-95 Bear. Introduced in 1956, it was the backbone of the Soviet nuclear strike fleet. The winner, the Boeing B-47. 2,000 B-47s, each with 6 engines and weighing in at 200,000 pounds, were built by the time its production run ended in 1957, and it remained in service well into the 1960s. The principal mission of the B-47 was nuclear deterrence. The concept then was if the Soviet Union became a threat or launched missiles at the U.S., the B-47, equipped with nuclear bombs, could, on a moment's notice, fly over the polar regions and attack. A young Air Force lieutenant, Carl Wayne Walksmith, had been assigned to B-47s in 1959.
Most of that was what we called home alert or reflex alert, with the airplane actually sitting cocked at the end of a runway or in a parking area very nearly the runway, ready to take off. In the U.S. here, we used to figure we needed to be airborne in 15 minutes. Some of the overseas bases I was at, or in Spain, they used to say we need to be off the ground 8 minutes after the horn went off. Because when the missile era started to creep in, then why the warning time went down to zip almost, and so we had to have very rapid response for that. But so it was a nuclear bomber, and probably would have done an excellent job if it had been recalled to do what it was designed for, because it was a maneuverable airplane. You could roll a B-47. Folks did it. I won't claim to have done it because it wasn't something you were supposed to do. It was a fast airplane. We flew, we could fly low level at 425 miles an hour, 425 knots, which is in excess of 500 miles an hour. It flew very well. It was a very responsive airplane. It had power controls, hydraulic power controls on all 3 axes, so that you didn't have to really horse it around.
The airplane, with its swept wings, pod-mounted engines, and bubble canopy, looked like a kind of cross between a jet fighter and an early commercial jet airliner.
3-man crew. You had an aircraft commander or pilot, co-pilot, and the navigator, who was also your radar bombardier, in the nose, and a rather black windowless compartment up there. But the 2 pilots sitting up in that bubble canopy, almost like a jet fighter, excellent view.
The closest the B-47 came to combat was during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961. Missiles from the Soviet Union aimed at the U.S. mainland were found on Cuba, primed and ready to fire. President Kennedy imposed a naval blockade against the Soviets and put all U.S. forces on a wartime footing. B-47s were among the airplanes assigned to maintain a presence over the Soviet fleet in the Western Atlantic and put on alert throughout the rest of the U.S.
Everybody was pretty grim during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and there's no denying that. We had a head start on it because SAC was already generating its entire force, putting this thing on alert and loading the airplanes before President Kennedy made his speech. So we were a little bit ahead of the game on that.
Requiring a full retaliatory response.
Ultimately, the Soviets backed down and agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba, and the crisis ended. The B-47 was the precursor to all jet transports, airliners, cargo aircraft, and large bombers that followed.
If you look at the B-47 and then look at every commercial airliner, every subsequent big bomber like the B-52 and so forth, the B-47 is granddaddy. The swept wing, streamlined fuselage, underslung engine pods were things that the designers at Boeing came up with. You look at everything we fly today that's a good-sized airplane, and it's the same lineage all the way through. We haven't really made any more leaps since that. This was the first of its era, and for the first crack out of the box was an outstanding airplane.
The next era of bomber evolution came between 1961 and 1970. A period that gave the world bombers that could be refueled in flight for global range, and bombers that could fly supersonic, faster than the speed of sound. The nominees for Best Bomber of the Era are the Convair B-58 Hustler, the world's first supersonic strategic bomber built of steel and in service for about 10 years. The B-52 Stratofortress. It can fly high or low to deliver as much as 30 tons of bombs on a mission. The Avro Vulcan, Britain's major nuclear deterrent. This delta-wing design attacked the Falklands during Britain's war with Argentina. The winner, the Boeing B-52. No other modern airplane has 8 engines. Like the B-47, the B-52 was conceived as a high-altitude nuclear bomber. But as artillery and surface-to-air missile technology evolved, B-52 tactics had to change. Its pilots now can conduct low-level attack missions too, roaring toward a target at jet speeds only a few hundred feet above the terrain. This bomber first served as a Cold War nuclear deterrent. Then it went into battle as a high-altitude bomber throughout Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. Colonel James Phillips started flying B-52s in 1971.
And our primary mission was long-range bombing of targets in the North and South Vietnam. The mission itself was pretty much matched the old story about hours of boredom interspersed with moments of stark terror, primarily because of the long drone time from Guam. There was probably about 6 hours over, about an hour in country, and then 6 hours home, the normal mission. The targets were generally supplies, weapons caches, suspected VC, Viet Cong truck parks, those kinds of things along the trail, along the DMZ, along the mountainside of South Vietnam. If we couldn't reach our primary target, there were alternate secondary targets that were pretty frequently bombed.
Colonel Timothy Sutherland also flew B-52s during Vietnam.
Aircraft, you needed to hold a very stable platform so that the rest of the subsequent members of the cell could maintain their position in the formation, so that when you came to the target area and you dropped your bombs, they fell where they were supposed to and not outside the target box.
When it comes to standard bombs, as the airplane carried over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, a B-52 can carry a massive load, normally up to 27 500 or 750-pound bombs internally and 24 more attached to wing pylons. Some D models used in Vietnam could carry 60,000 pounds of bombs, the equivalent of a fully loaded B-17, the whole airplane with its crew, fuel, and bombs. In Southeast Asia, attacking B-52s dropped tons of bombs from altitudes well above the anti-aircraft ground fire.
I mean, there's no pre-announcement, there's no aircraft noise, there's nothing to tell the enemy that the bombs are on the way until that last few seconds of a screaming bomb drop that you hear in the movies, and then you're hit. So it's just a terror weapon, if nothing else. Not designed for that, because it is so effective in its kill radius. But not knowing when it's going to come, not knowing what it's going to do, not knowing when it's going to be there, that is a tremendous capability that we have because of the volume. I've been on both ends of that. I've dropped them, and I've been near the ground when they hit, and it's just an awesome sight to see that much dirt and debris just pick up and go vertical because of the volume of that weapon load.
Actually, it was a good mission for the B-52. It had the legs to do the job. It had the capability to haul the weapons to do the job. It had the accuracy, given the time and the technology available to do the job as well. So it was a good mission for the B-52.
B-52s remain in service today, 3 decades after Vietnam. One of the key bases for these looming bombers and its pilots is Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. When B-52s went to war in the Persian Gulf, it wasn't widely known at the time, but B-52s, armed with cruise missiles, flew from Barksdale halfway around the world to become the first attackers against Iraq in the Persian Gulf War of 1991. And they did it again to attack in the Gulf in 1996. Captain Warren Ward flew that grueling mission in 1991.
First mission I flew out of Desert Storm actually launched out of Barksdale in Louisiana. We weren't in Saudi Arabia, we weren't overseas, we were here at Barksdale. The war started on the 17th of January of 91. We launched our airplanes on the 16th. And we had cruise missiles on board the aircraft, 7 airplanes. Everybody was scared to death. Anyway, it was a roughly 18-hour drive over to the Middle East, to our launch points for the cruise missiles, and launched our weapons, turned around and came home.
When the massive B-52 first began flying for the United States Air Force in 1955, no one could have imagined that it would still be in operations today. 4 decades later, after fighting in 2 wars with many modifications, the Air Force has committed to operating the airplane to the year 2040.
I love the airplane. I mean, it's an incredible sensation. It is so large. The advantage of the B-52 is knowing that it has a tremendous warfighting capability, what we are actually in the Air Force to do. It is a wonderful machine that can be made into an almost human experience because of its ability to adapt, to overcome whatever area it may be asked to perform. And I think that is a characteristic of an aircraft that is almost human-like. So it's a love affair, there's no doubt about it.
The current era for bombers from 1971 to present introduces aircraft more tuned to the needs of the present than to the Cold War or carpet bombing era of the past. Smaller, lighter bombers, more fit for smaller regional conflicts, have joined the fleet. They fly at speeds measured by Mach numbers rather than miles an hour, designed principally for low-level attack. Nominees for the best bombers of the current era are the Panavia Tornado, a European consortium airplane used principally as a low-level strike bomber. It attacked airfields during the Gulf War. The General Dynamics F-111, its terrain-following capability gives its pilots the ability to fly at 200 feet above the ground, even at night in bad weather. The Rockwell B-1 Lancer. For the Cold War, it was a supersonic nuclear weapons bomber. Now, it can strike with 80,000 pounds of a variety of weapons. And the winner, the General Dynamics F-111. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of the airplane is its swing-wing design. The wings move automatically to the position best suited to the speed and altitude demanded for a particular stage of flight. Backwards to the maximum angle of sweep for high-speed flight. extended almost straight sidewards for slow flight and for landings. Pilots from Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico flew F-111s. They were assigned some of the most difficult missions during the Gulf War. Colonel Gale Larson.
For the very specific mission that it does, high-speed, low-altitude penetrator with a night all-weather capability at low altitude with its terrain-following radar systems, there's probably nothing in the inventory that has that payload capability and that range that the F-111 has.
Major Vic Casalena.
The F-111 has the ability to sweep its wings back, and what this does is the faster you go, the more you can sweep your wings back, and you can get to speeds on the deck in excess of 1.3 times the speed of sound. And this gave me great confidence because nobody's really going to catch you.
For what it does, as a high-speed, low-altitude penetrator, it's very stable with its high wing loading. You can go very fast, and it's very smooth down at low altitude. I like that a lot. The aircraft is designed to do that. It's fully within the capability of the aircraft. In fact, we can fly with a terrain-following radar system from 200 feet AGL above the ground to 1,000 feet above the ground.
And finally, we also have precision-guided bombs. These bombs are laser guided and will hit a target exactly where you want it to hit. Other bombs that we have a TV camera in the front of the bomb, and I actually had my weapons system officer say he was going to put it through a window that was 3 foot by 3 foot, and that's exactly what he did. It doesn't get any better than that.
At the outset of the Gulf War, Colonel Larson's first mission.
Flew the aircraft in Desert Storm for the whole course of the war. Probably the most significant sortie was the first night when we flew for 7 hours. Took off out of Saudi Arabia, Taif, Saudi Arabia. I was the second four-ship to take off. We took off as a four-ship, went to a pre-strike tanker, and then proceeded to the border and went low altitude on a TFR down to a 400-foot set clearance plane. And we flew low level for about 45 minutes into our target and did a night toss delivery on an airfield, and then egress back out at 400 feet, climbed back out and made a recovery into Taif, Saudi Arabia. So that was an interesting night, certainly the most memorable night of Desert Storm for me.
One critical Gulf War mission for the F-111 was to counter Saddam Hussein's threat to pump 8 million gallons of crude oil into the Persian Gulf. Major Rick Walker, with 27 Desert Storm missions, flew that nighttime attack.
It was decided that somehow that had to be stopped, but the only way they could think to do it was to destroy the pumps which pumped the oil from the storage tanks out into the Gulf. Numbers 1 and 2 of the four-ship were going to guide the weapon, and 3 and 4 were the ones to deliver. Each was going to deliver one bomb. I was the number 4 aircraft. We got 4 aircraft to the target. 1 and 2 set up their orbit, and as number 3, as he was delivering his weapon, he dropped it, pulled away. Number 2 immediately picked up the signal from that bomb. He was able to acquire the target and guide it in for the first hit on the pump manifold.
At this point, Major Walker and his weapons systems officer dropped their weapon. The number 2 ship guided it to the target, while Walker's crewmate tracked the bomb.
He could see on his screen the final part of the bomb hitting the second pump manifold. So in those two weapons, and we hit both targets with the first try each time and carried everything else home.
The F-111 is the best bomber today based on the capabilities that it has, the terrain-following radar and the wing sweep and the precision-guided munitions.
As I left Lakenheath to go to Saudi Arabia, I told my wife as I stepped out the door, if I have to go fly in combat, that the F-111F was the aircraft I wanted to fly in.
So here are the winners from each era, the finalists for Best Bomber. Gotha G4 and G5. Heinkel HE-111. Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Boeing B-47 Stratojet. Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. General Dynamics F-111. And which one wins as Best Bomber? the best bomber of all time, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Look at its record, its impact on the war. B-17s, with 12,677 of them sent to war, became the single most potent bombing platform of World War II. In Europe and the Mediterranean, B-17s flew 291,508 sorties and dropped over 640,000 tons of bombs. For its defensive capabilities, B-17Gs carried 13 50-caliber machine guns, each equipped with 750 rounds, or about a minute's worth of continuous fire. Those guns, and later the fighter escorts, gave it the ability to penetrate hostile airspace like no other bomber. Range. It had the ability to carry 4,000 pounds of bombs, 1,850 miles, and return. A mission that could take nearly 9 hours at 25,000 feet. Bomb load. The B-17G could carry up to 17,600 pounds worth of explosive destruction if range was not a factor. Accuracy. The B-17 had the Norden bomb sight, the ultimate bombing advance at the time. For survivability, its strength and four-engine redundancy made it legendary, and the statistics prove it. B-17s flew so many missions, over 290,000, surviving enemy attack over and over. Ultimately, 4,688 B-17s became casualties of war. But those losses, compared to the number of missions flown, came to only 1.6%, among the lowest ever.
The fact that I can look back on those periods and knowing what this airplane did and the damage that it took, and that the times that it brought us back to England in dreadful shape, with fire coming out one wing and fuel coming out the other wing, things of this nature, because of what it did, what I know of it, and the way that the airplane flies and is still flying. I don't see how any other aircraft can combat that as far as that's concerned. I don't see any comparison with others.
All in its time, it was, I think, the best because of its flight characteristics, its ability to absorb battle damage and return home, and the fact that the pilots trusted it because it was a good aircraft to fly.
Oh, I think it's a great airplane. It's kind of a part of our history, and you talk to people over in Europe that went on the receiving end of it, and they don't seem to have much animosity toward it, and I think it was a great airplane for what it was designed to do.
When I walked into this airplane in 1943, it was the largest airplane in the world, and I had no idea what I was doing there, but I was happy as I could be. I was a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Air Forces. I was a pilot, and I had just married the prettiest girl in my town, and I was flying the biggest airplane in the world, and it don't get any better than that.
If the B-17 was the best bomber of the past, what does the future hold? The future may already be here with the advent of an airplane initially called a fighter, but in combat so far used exclusively as a strike bomber, the F-117 stealth fighter. It was the first operational airplane with stealth design and technology, giving it the ability to be essentially invisible to enemy radar. And it was one of the primary bombers of the Gulf War. General Buster Glosson, now retired, directed air operations during the Gulf War.
I know a lot of people have sought to look into how we were able to fly that many sorties over and over and over that successful with the 117. Stealth technology made that possible. That's really where it stops, and that's where it ends. That's what we took advantage of. That's what contributed to saving so many thousands of lives. Stealth technology and precision, the two key words in this air campaign and in this war.
For strategic bombing, the B-2, a larger bomber flying wing-like in design and incorporating stealth features, recently went into service for the U.S. Air Force. General Joseph Ralston is the Air Force member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
I believe that it will. It's a wonderful platform in terms of long range. It can carry a big payload, and when we get it outfitted with precision attack munitions, it will be quite a machine. Whenever our commanders need firepower delivered accurately, on time, the B-2 can do that. It can do it without forward basing, and it can do it with much less support than what other bombers have managed to do.
But in terms of sheer numbers, the aircraft that's been the mainstay of the U.S. bomber fleet for 4 decades won't be going away.
Well, first of all, you will have the B-52 should be around for a long time in the 21st century. The average B-52 has fewer landings and fewer hours than the average Boeing 767 in service today. So airframe life is not a problem. The B-1 will have about 95 B-1s that will be around for a long time. And then we'll have the 21 B-2s that should be around for most of the century of the 21st century.
Since the earliest crude attempts at dropping bombs from airplanes, bombing, its means, methods, the aircraft, and the weapons have changed dramatically. Where tons of bombs used to fall to assure decimation of a target, 1 or 2 can accomplish the task now. But half a century ago, when the winning bomber, the B-17, was in battle, bombing was less refined. Bomber crews took their airplanes without the benefit of fighter support into dangerously hostile environments. Those crews in their B-17s fought for their lives and their ideals again and again, and ultimately prevailed. For them, even then, the B-17 proved to be the ultimate weapon.